thank you ever so much for coming to listen to me today. My name is Debbie Ison. I'm a therapist who is trained in 13 different therapies. I predominantly use hypnotherapy, but lots and lots of different things. And I also train therapists in hypnotherapy, past life regression, and Reiki. What I'm here to talk to you about today, however, is a new project that I'm doing. I am just embarking on doing my PhD at university, and I thought, do you know what? You've all been here for me throughout my career, seeing me learn and grow and develop. So I'm going to introduce what I'm doing to you guys first. So what I'm going to be studying at university is something called parapsychology. So with parapsychology, to be honest, even when I applied for my course, I didn't really know what it was. I'd heard the word parapsychology lots of times. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you why I'm doing what I'm doing, what parapsychology is and isn't, and also what it explores and how we can use it therapeutically. So I first started to hear the word parapsychology probably in my early 20s when I started watching programmes like Most Haunted. I don't know if any of you watched that. And I sort of thought, do you know what? Maybe it means going on ghost hunts. And that sounded quite exciting to me. Not something I wanted to do myself because it was terrifying. Turns out it's not about ghost hunting. It took me a few years longer before I realised that. The next time I started to hear that word was a couple of years ago when I was listening to a podcast, which some of you may have heard, called Uncanny. It's a BBC podcast, and there's also been a TV series. And on that, what they do is they will listen to a story about something supernatural, and then they will have some experts. They'll have one expert that is on the believer's side, and another expert who is the skeptic or the non-believer. And they have to talk about their different theories of why it may be something paranormal or why it may not be. And there was some of those times I was listening to some of those episodes and I thought, oh, do you know what? Those parapsychologists sound a bit scary because some of them had some really strong views that were quite different to mine. And I found myself listening a couple of times and thinking, some of the sceptical arguments sounded even more far-fetched than on the side of the believers. But I still wasn't really any the wiser about what a parapsychologist really did. And it's only now that I'm about to start my studies that I'm aware of that. So in order to get to this point, what happened was during my therapeutic career, I do lots of transpersonal based work, lots of spiritual work. That was not something I ever planned on, but my clients had different ideas. And a few years ago when I was in a session, what happened is a client presented with a number of different voices coming out of her that each claimed to be a deceased human being. And I was a little bit frightened. But I thought, I'm in the therapy session, I've just got to go with this, I've got to help this person. So I started working with each of the alleged spirits as if they were clients sat in front of me. And I provided each one of them with therapy, using the tools and techniques I have, and sent them off into the light. I didn't like that experience, I was quite traumatised by it. However, after several months of coming to terms with it, and I actually got some therapy myself for PTSD because I was quite traumatised by the situation, I one day resigned myself and accepted it, and I said, right, do you know what, universe? If I'm meant to do this work, I will do, but you never give me anything as terrifying as that again, and you never give me anything that I can't handle. Within an hour, I started getting clients, left, right, centre, all over the place, coming with these similar experiences. And I had to learn very, very quickly. So now, several hundred clients later, I feel calm with it. I feel safe and okay. And it was only going to be something I ever did because I don't know about you, but lots of you may have had paranormal or supernatural experiences, but there is a taboo in our society still about talking about them openly. Either because people may think you are crazy or that you are lying. However, as I got more confident, I started to speak more and more openly about what I did as a therapist, and I found that was very, very important for the clients I worked with. Because a lot of those clients said, has anybody else ever experienced anything like this? And actually, yes. I found more and more people were coming to me explaining different unusual experiences they'd had in childhood and in adulthood. And the common thing people would say to me is, I've never told anybody this, but. And this is far more normal than we perceive. And after a while, several of my clients all said to me, look, will you write a book about this? I will donate my case study to be in that book. I thought, I'm not sure if I want to do this. But I thought, go on then. So I've written a book. It's not published yet. So I wrote my book and I got it sent off and I paid an editor to look at it because I thought if I'm going to put something out there, it needs to be done properly. And what happened next is the day the editor got back to me and said, yeah, it's all ready to go, my husband came back from a sound bath. So my husband is a therapist as well. Now, going back a little bit, what had happened with that first client is at the time I didn't have the skills to help her. So she'd ended up in the mental health system. And thankfully, she'd met this incredible mental health nurse who said to her, I don't believe this is mental illness. I believe this is a spiritual emergency. And he helped her. So in my book, she's the first case study and she finishes my book. And it's all about her meeting this gentleman and helping her. So my husband had been to a sound bath and he said, I've been speaking to this amazing man. He told me he was a retired mental health nurse, had been doing it for 35 years. And sometimes he felt that people that had mental health issues, there was also spiritual elements involved, and we needed to be working with the person holistically. And I said to my husband, do you think that could be the man that I've written about in my book? Turns out it is. So we arranged to meet up, and he did a podcast with me. I do the Tranquil Awakenings podcast. So if you want to listen to that, it's called Tomato Dave. And we had a conversation about what I do, about what he does. And at the end, he said to me, Debbie, if you'd be willing to come into the mental health system, would you be willing to talk to the junior doctors about what I do? I was like, oh, yes, I would. But then I was like, why is anybody going to take notice of me? And at that point, it popped into my head, whether it was divine guidance, whether it was my own thought processes, you need to do a PhD now. I was like, really? Do I need to do a PhD? It's something I've thought about in the past, but I didn't think I was academically capable. But this message came through loud and strong, so I thought, right, I'm going to have a think about this. Now, luckily, by another coincidence, if you want to call it that, when my children moved schools, I bumped into a lady. I parked outside her house, and she was called Caroline. And within a couple of minutes, we got chatting. And she'd explained to me that she was just starting her career in parapsychology, doing a PhD. So I went round to her house that night and said, Caroline, I've had this idea. I think I want to do a PhD in parapsychology. Do you think I'm academically capable? Do you think I've got what it takes? And she said, absolutely. But I don't think you're meant to be doing it where I do it. I think you need to speak to an associate professor at Northampton called Cal Cooper. I was like, right, okay. So I was driving home from her house, 5 or 6 minutes away, and it just kept popping into my head, you need to speak to Barry John about this. Now, I don't know if any of you remember, there's a gentleman that often comes to the wellbeing shows called Barry John, who's a medium. Now, I love Barry John, he's great, but don't really know him that well personally, because when we're at these shows, it's just a passing hello. And it just kept persisting, so I thought, right, I'm going to have to contact Barry. So I got my phone out, I was like, hi, Barry, I know this is really weird, but it's come into my head that I need to do a PhD in parapsychology, and for some reason I've got to ask you, what do you think? And he got back to me straight away and he says, absolutely, go for it. He says, you need to speak to my very good friend at Northampton University, Cal Cooper. So 5 minutes later, I was in contact with Cal, and I was like, wow, this feels like it's aligning. I had further confirmation a couple of weeks later when I was driving to the Mansfield Mind Body Spirit show, and it just popped into my head, you're going to meet Cal today. And I laughed at myself because I thought, what a random thought. And why would a professor from Northampton University be at a Mansfield Mind Body Spirit show? So I put it out of my mind. I was there, and then in the afternoon, I saw somebody walk past my stand. That's Cal. So I went up and I was like, hi, you don't know me, but I'm this lady that was speaking to you a couple of weeks ago, and we got introduced. Now, he doesn't go to Mind Body Spirit shows. He was taking his daughter to a swimming lesson and just had the urge to pull in. So that is why I'm doing a PhD. once I got signed up, I thought, right, I probably need to really look now about what parapsychology actually is, because I'm going to be studying it for the next few years. I feel very confident talking about my chosen subject, which is the therapeutic impact of spirit release therapy on non-clinical populations. That's the first time I've said it out loud. But what is parapsychology? So I started to research it, and I've been very lucky. The university have already had me in listening to some of their undergraduate lectures. So what parapsychology is, it's a branch of psychology that looks at those unusual experiences that we have as human beings. Those things that are perhaps not yet explained by science. And lots of us have these experiences. And it wasn't until I started looking into this. There is a lot of information out there. There's lots of research out there. So what parapsychologists aim to do is they aim to look at these different experiences we have, these paranormal experiences that are beyond normal, and work out what's going on. So they may not be able to definitively say the root of where something comes from, whether something is a spirit or not, whether it is a different phenomena, but what they can start to look at is the evidence and say, well, how many people are experiencing this? How can we design experiments around this to test it? So that's quite exciting. And actually now I've joined them, they're lovely. So the thought of they're going to think I'm crazy because I've had all these experiences isn't the case at all. They're just fascinated and they do amazing work. So with parapsychology, what we do is we look at different things. So some of that is psychokinesis, which is the idea that we can move objects or things with our thoughts, with our mind, setting that intention. We also look at what do we do beyond the five senses, that extrasensory perception. And we look at survival research as to what happens to consciousness beyond death. And the way this started out was going all the way back to sort of 1840s. There was some people called the Fox sisters, mediums, and people started to take an interest in that. And during the Victorian era, more and more people started to do seances. There was that physical mediumship. And it got a lot of media interest. And there was a group of researchers that said, you know what? We need to start looking at the evidence for this. So they got together and they created the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And they started to perform experiments. So they were looking at things like precognition, that idea that we can have a thought or a dream about something that hasn't yet happened. They started to look at what were mediums doing. Were there ghosts? Were there apparitions? Were there hauntings? And they would explore them. And that carried on developing. So then in the 1920s, it started to get more into universities. So I believe Harvard University, a university in London, and they started to look at psychokinesis, this ability to perhaps manipulate things with our minds. And also that extrasensory perception of knowing things that maybe we can't possibly know or be aware of. And there was a couple called the Rhines, and they started to create these cards. And I don't know if you've seen them. They're sort of 5 cards that they worked with that had a circle and a star and a squiggle and a cross, and they've got different shapes. And they started to make things more standardised, more statistical, by getting people to predict what was on the card that was drawn. And during that, the scientific way of working started to develop more. So they think, well, do you know what? Maybe it's the way the person's drawn the card. So how can we draw the card without the person knowing? Perhaps we could put them in envelopes. Perhaps we could do it where the person isn't present in the same room. So every time they did an experiment, they started to think, how can we eliminate the bias? How can we get rid of the bits that people are going to say, well, you've done that experiment wrong. That doesn't make any sense. There's a flaw in that. And that's where it's developed. So over time, there's more and more of these explorations going on. And what I love about it now is just in the same way psychology looks at the human mind, as does parapsychology. And it starts from the human experience. Because we as humans are having these experiences and they all start in the mind. And whether you believe in these things or not, people through all cultures and all times have had these experiences. Therefore, they are of value to be exploring them. So it's further split down then into, when we're looking at extrasensory perception, we will be looking at things like telepathy. reading other people's minds. Is that possible? Now, there was a strange scenario a few years ago in our house where I believe we had an example of telepathy. I was busy in the kitchen, putting away my shopping in the old house, and I was singing to myself in my head. I was singing Shiny from Moana. I had little children at the time, and so singing away, my husband walks in from work, and he says to me, "Debbie, are you singing Shiny from Moana?" And I turned and I was like, "I am, but how do you know that? Because I'm not saying anything out loud, and you can't see me because my head is in a fridge." Now, that spooked me out a little bit. I thought, I don't really want my husband knowing all of my thoughts. But it's only happened occasionally since. He seems to be very good at that. What we're also looking for extra sensory perception-wise is clairvoyance. So that ability for people to know about perhaps the whereabouts of objects or to receive information they can't possibly know. And you'll meet lots of individuals on the wellbeing circuit that are mediums, that bring information forwards or that are psychic. We're then looking at that precognition of bringing forward how do we know information that hasn't happened yet. So for example, that precognition may have been when I was driving to the Mansfield show and it popped into my head that I would meet Cal. That's an example of something that hasn't happened yet, but it's come into my mind. And I remember when I was younger, my Auntie Wendy explaining that she'd had some experiences of precognition. One of them was that she had dreamt about the Lockerbie bombings. And that really freaked her out when that actually happened. And I think this is fairly normal. Lots of us have these experiences, but we don't talk about them in case people think we're weird. But psychology is now opening up to look at that more. So there are actually now about 12, 13 universities across the country that within their psychology training at undergraduate level, so when you're doing your degrees, now give an offering of learning about parapsychology. And then there's about half a dozen universities across the country that will let you do a PhD in it. Now, what I like about parapsychology is there's massive overlaps. There's massive overlaps with anthropology, massive overlaps with social awareness, biology, neurochemistry, physics, all of these different things that are intertwined. And just in the same way as if we're exploring psychology in general, they have massive impacts on who we are. They look at our emotions, they look at our belief systems, they look at that positive psychology, they look at scientific methodology, and just what is it like to be human? And that can be used in clinical practice. Now, something I've always been really interested in is that psychokinesis element. So that is the idea of being able to manipulate something with the mind. And I don't know if any of you can remember, there used to be a gentleman, Uri Geller, when I was a child and younger, and he used to be on the telly bending spoons. I was fascinated by that. I could never do it, but I always tried. And I remember being about 8 years old, I was always interested in these things. And I had a cupcake doll. Now, I don't know if any of you had a cupcake doll, but it was this plastic doll, and it had a cupcake hat, and it had this skirt, but you could turn the skirt inside out, and all of a sudden it looked like a cupcake. It was all the rage. And I decided one day, me and my friend Lindsay, we were going to make it move with our minds. So we plonked it on my chest of drawers and we sat and stared at it for ages. We were convinced it moved a little bit. I don't think it did, but when you're a child, you really hope for these things. So what parapsychology also does is it looks at how can we look at these phenomena within a laboratory? How can we study it to see if things actually happen? Now, the other element, which is particularly where I'm interested, is the evidence of survival research. So that will look at different things. So it will look at mediums. How do mediums get that information? How accurate is that information? But more importantly, what I think is how does it impact the person that is receiving that information? What I like a lot about parapsychology is it's looking at how does it impact that human? How does it impact their belief systems and how does it help them? So I'm very interested because of my work on the clinical side of things. How can we use parapsychology in a clinical way to help people? Other experiences it will look at are things like near-death experiences. And some of you may have had one of those experiences where you're in a life-threatening situation and perhaps for some reason you temporarily pass away. Now, I had a friend years ago and that happened to her. and she was having an operation, heart stopped, and what she observed was that she was watching her body. And then she felt herself floating away and saw a beautiful light. This being of light came forward and gave her a message and said, "Go back, it's not time to go yet." And with that, that completely transformed the way she felt. All of a sudden, she had no fear of death because actually she knew it was okay. She felt it was okay. She recognised that she was more than just a body. She was a soul or a consciousness. And it changed the way she lived life. She was more compassionate, more caring, and she changed her whole career based on that experience. And there are lots of documented cases of this throughout the world where people have those near-death experiences and it changes the person's view of reality. It often comes with a change of belief system or a profound sense of peace. And I'm very excited, one of the new PhD students that's going to be working with me, her study is going to be all about people that have had those near-death experiences. So that's super exciting. We'll also look at things like end-of-life experiences. So some of you may have experienced guiding a loved one through the dying process. That was a big thing with me and one of my best friends, Karen, a few years ago. And as I went to see her in the hospice, she had a lot of spiritual-based experiences in those final days, including that sense and feeling that her family had come for her. Her dad was there, her granddad was there, her brother-in-law was there. They were all waiting for her to take her, and it filled her with a sense of peace. So we'll look at situations like that, what is happening as people pass away. And we may be looking at that from the patient, the client's perspective, but also we may be looking at it from the practitioner's perspective. What do they perceive? Another area they'll look at is past life regression. And now this is one of my passions because as a therapist, I do a lot of past life regression sessions. And how I work in a past life regression session is the individual comes to work with me, we get them nice and relaxed, and so I take them into hypnosis. Now, hypnosis isn't mind control. I can't make anyone do anything they don't want to do. It's a state of focused awareness where they're less concerned about their external environment and have gone more into their internal thought processes. And once I've taken them in that state, I direct their mind to take them to a previous past life that is significant and relevant for them to explore. Now, some people may say, do you know what? That's a construct of the mind. That's okay. Other people will believe that is a genuine past life experience. Some people may say, do you know what? It's epigenetics. It's something within our DNA that we don't fully understand that's passed down. But I use this experience therapeutically to help people. So I take them to their past life. We go to all the significant events within that past life. So we find out as much detail as possible about the life and what happened. And then I guide the person through their death. So they find out how they die. And that's a bit gruesome sometimes. History isn't always kind to people. And then what I like to do is I like to explore an in-between life state. So this is where you're back at soul or consciousness. And I find out questions so that in that lifetime, what lessons did you learn? How has it impacted your present lifetime? Are there any traumas or issues from that lifetime that are impacting your lifetime now? And if so, what healing do we need to do to shift things? Was there anybody you knew in that lifetime that you also recognise in this lifetime? And what are the dynamics like? And why have you chosen to incarnate as you are now? It's fascinating. So parapsychology would also look at those experiences. So it's very much intertwined with what is consciousness. Is consciousness something within the body or is it something beyond the body? Does it survive after death? And what I love about those experiences is once again you get a similar thing happening, that often people lose their fear of dying. They often get great comfort. Do you know what? That you come back to your loved ones time and time again. And it tends to make you more loving and more forgiving because you recognise sometimes you make mistakes and they need to be put right. Sometimes other people make mistakes and it can be put right. So we're starting to see parallels between the past life research and experience and the near-death experience. Now, there's actually lots and lots of scientific research out there on past life experience and phenomena. There was a psychologist called Dr. Ian Stevenson, and he decided to do research on young children who had spontaneous recall of their past life experiences. And he interviewed over 2,000 children and their families. Lots of them were from India, but all different parts of the world. And he found that up until about the age of 5 or 6, some children seemed to have vivid recollections of their past lives. And he only used those cases where there was lots of facts that could be quantified, that could be looked at and researched. And what he found was fascinating. So some of these children could say where hidden treasures were buried in the past lives. They could tell all sorts of family secrets. They knew all sorts of details they couldn't have possibly known. And what he also found was a lot of those children, perhaps if they had a missing limb or a birthmark, that correlated to the way that they had died in the previous life, and they could find that from death records. And all of that was documented, but it's in academic papers. And as I'm starting to read academic papers, oh my gosh, they're complicated. It's a load of gobbledygook at the moment to me. So this is why I like to do talks like this, so we can bring it down to a level of how most of us speak in day-to-day life. So what we're starting to draw in is all of these different experiences that people have had to find out really, who are we? What are we? What are we capable of? Because we just don't know. So wherever you lie on that spectrum of whether you believe in something or not, there is that opportunity to explore, and there are people researching and looking at this. Now, what I love also when you're looking at past life research is that there's another lady, Helen Wambach, and she looked at different cases of past lives, and she didn't find everybody was Elvis or somebody famous. What she looked at is she looked at different periods in history, and she found that the people that were regressed were normal people. The majority of them were peasants or poor people. The majority of them had spoilt food. They could describe the utensils that they would have had in those time periods. There was very few rich people. So looking at historical information and making those comparisons, you could see there was a link. Now that doesn't prove whether a past life is real or not, but what it's showing is there are some correlations out there. And then there's the stuff that I am specialising in. So sometimes things like hauntings and apparitions are looked at. So they'll be looked at things like, there's an example, I think, is it in York or somewhere, where there's a Roman soldier that walks through a place over and over again and lots of people see it, almost like a tape recording. Some people call that the Stonewall effect. Whereas other times there may be a perceived spirit interacting with things that are going on. And sometimes that goes into poltergeist phenomena, so that's something we would also look at. Now, they often think poltergeist phenomena is a form of psychokinesis, that perhaps some person's energy in their body is disturbed and it causes things to move around. Poltergeist means noisy spirit. And they often say that teenagers, particularly teenage girls, I think when you're going through hormones, lots of changes in emotions, or individuals who are going through a period of intense stress, that's often when this poltergeist activity tends to occur. And it tends to differ from traditional hauntings because it will happen normally for about 6 months, but sometimes up to a couple of years, where it'll start with perhaps little things like tiny little taps or bangs, and then more things might start to move and it escalates. It gets to a peak and then it tends to subside. Whereas hauntings tend to go over a prolonged period of time and are more consistent with the behaviour. Now, once again, I was really interested in that because when I was growing up, we lived in what I believe was a haunted house, and it was scary. So I remember being very, very tiny and my brother going into his bedroom of his own. So I must have been 2 years old or less, and I remember seeing a grey figure that used to walk up and down the corridor. I remember being a teenager and waking up in the night and seeing this grey figure sat on my bed and then staring over me. I remember things escalating so that we started to hear furniture dragging around the house, and when we looked it wasn't. So eventually where we started to see things being thrown, like a tub of margarine, a knife, and then eventually it subsided. And my mum's in here as well, so she used to know about some of these things. But what was interesting is we spoke about it as adults. What I didn't know as a child is when my brother was put into his bedroom when he was little, his cot sides used to be taken down. And it was only when sort of blessed items were put in the house, it settled a bit. But this is where I've got this interest. But it was really, really scary, so I didn't want to go anywhere near it. However, as I've overcome that, now I'm going back to university, and now I'm studying these perceived interactions with spirit. So how I tend to work is I work with a person, take them into hypnosis, and I ask their mind to take them to the energetic origin of the issue. Now that could be absolutely anything. It could be something that's happened in their adult life. It could be something that's happened in their childhood. It could be something to do with their work or their home life or their relationships. But sometimes their mind does something else. Sometimes their mind will go back to a past life. And that's the first time I had experiences with past life phenomena, was I had a gentleman that came to work with me because he needed to go into an MRI scan. And he was very frightened of confined spaces. And I just asked his mind casually to go back to where it began, not really thinking anything much of it, until he started speaking in an American accent. I was like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And so I just asked him the questions, and he described how he was a greengrocer in America and been walking along the street one day, lived with his adult daughter and wife, and a piece of scaffolding fell down, bashed him on his head, dead. Or so they thought. So they went and they laid him out in the living room, and he laid there for several days until they buried him. When he was being buried, he woke up. He was alive. Now, thankfully, there was a bell in that coffin, and he rang the bell. They got him out of the coffin, and he lived the rest of his life disabled, very frustrated because he couldn't carry on with his greengrocer work. His wife and daughter had to do it. But it left him with this overwhelming fear of confined spaces. So as soon as we addressed that and released it, he was okay. And he went for his MRI scan a few days later. So I thought, oh, that's weird. I don't want anything to do with that. And then that started happening more frequently until it just became a part of my work. What can also happen sometimes is when I ask the person's mind to go back to the energetic origin, is sometimes people explain being in the womb. They explain the birthing experience and what that was like for them. And once again, modern science tells us, well, we can't really do that because everything in the brain's still forming. But that's if we believe we are a physical being. If we're a consciousness or a soul, then perhaps we do have that awareness. Other times people say it's something external to them. So sometimes people will say something to me like, I'm seeing a scary face, I'm hearing a scary voice, it doesn't belong to me. Other times, it may be that something's like, it says, it's dark, it feels uncomfortable inside me. I don't like what I'm sensing, there's something intimidating. So I'll ask questions. Are you an internal part of this person, or are you something external? If it identifies it's something external, I work with it as if it's an own being in its own right. Now, whether that is or not, I can never prove, but what we do is we help to bring therapeutic change. So I will talk with that being and find out if it has a name, how long it's been with the person, why it's with that person, what does it want and need, if it passed away, how did it pass away, and I do the therapeutic work with it until it feels better, and then send it off into the light. Once I've done that, and once we've got rid of all of those things, we can then proceed to do the work on helping the client. But what I've noticed is there's patterns and correlations within that. So what I tend to find is once that work's done, there is very rapid and profound change within the individual. They often start to feel a lot better physically, mentally, and emotionally. But also, as I've started documenting all of these cases in my book and as I write them all down, they tend to say the same sort of things. So if it classes itself as a human soul, it will often have not gone into the light because there was a trauma. It didn't realise it had passed away. There was some sort of addiction involved. They wanted some sort of revenge, or they wanted to comfort a loved one. Same patterns over and over again. If something comes through and says it's non-human, I then have to work out what else might it be. And once again, patterns tend to emerge. So other types of beings would come forwards and say lots of swear words at me, lots of threats at me, and be quite angry. Once again, another pattern. Didn't like that when that first started happening. I very quickly employed my primary school teacher skills of, bless you, you sound very angry right now. What makes you feel angry? So, because normally I find when somebody's angry, it means they're afraid. And if you're afraid of something, that probably shows me at some point in your past something really hurt you. what hurt you? So all the way I'm having to keep talking like it's a naughty child, but I'm being very compassionate to get those beings to a point where they don't want to swear at me anymore, they don't want to threaten me or the client anymore, and they're ready to go. But once again, it's the same process, a completely different process to if they class themselves as human, but the same process that works time and time again. So I thought, do you know what? If I'm experiencing this, then other people have got to be experiencing this in various forms as well. And I started looking up people that have written books on this. And I was absolutely amazed because there was a gentleman I found called William Baldwin, and he found the same things that were working, the same sort of classifications. So I really want to study this. I want to look into this at university. So I'm not trying to prove the ontology, what these things are. What I am hoping to show, however, is whether or not different therapists have had these experiences where people feel they've got something with them. How do those therapists deal with it? And what impact does that have on both the client, short-term and long-term, and also the therapist that's dealing with that? And I'm hoping I can create a body of research, because there's not a lot of research in this subject, about how we can use this to help people. Because coming back to when I had that conversation with Tomato Dave, what he pointed out is there are a lot of people that are institutionalised out there. There are a lot of people within society that are heavily medicated because they're hearing voices and seeing things. Now, they may have chemical imbalances in their body. It's likely that they have got mental health issues or traumas from their past. But if they are presenting, saying, I'm hearing and seeing these things, why are we not working with that directly alongside everything else? Yeah. Because actually that could make a really big difference to their well-being. I'm all for, as a therapist, you work with wherever your client is. You work with whatever they give you as a starting point, and you move them from the unhelpful to the helpful, that maladaptive to adaptive. I'm practicing my scientific words there. So that they can feel better. And by doing that, you give them the tools to equip themselves with how to deal with that. So what I'm doing by learning about all this parapsychology stuff, is that I'm going to be able to get some research there as a starting point so that I can challenge the system and take it on. Yeah. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of parapsychology. But what I do believe there is this therapeutic benefit, this clinical benefit. And what studies have shown time and time again is if somebody's had these experiences, we shouldn't be telling them that it's wrong, that it's shameful, that there's an issue here. We should be supporting them with it, because that can be very cathartic and very healing. Because I suspect if I look around this room, there'll be lots of you, if I said, have you ever had an experience where you've had déjà vu? Lots of you may have experienced that. Have you ever felt that you've seen a ghost or a spirit or heard something? Lots of you will have had those experiences. Have you ever had that precognition where you've just known something's going to happen? There's a lot of us that have those experiences, and until we start talking about it more openly, we tend to keep it hidden. So if I can do my tiny bit therapeutically to help people, whether it's past life, spirit release, even just exploring those altered states of consciousness, then I can make a difference. So thank you ever so much for listening to me talk today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you go and get on, because I know lots of you like to sit in on these talks, so you might need a wee, you might want to go and grab something to eat, have that time. But if any of you have got any questions you want to ask me, or anything you want to share, any of those things that, do you know what, I've had this experience but I've never told anybody, I'm more than happy to listen, either now here for a few minutes or back at my stall. So my stall is Tranquil Awakenings, and I'm on this side, left, is that right where you come in? The left side. Come and find me and have a chat. I love to hear about these things. So thank you ever so much for your time. Thank you.